Like our book from last week, Gordon's work on the American Revolution focuses on South Carolina, obviously from the title. Now, unlike Edgar's work, however, Gordon widens his research and doesn't just focus on the partisan engagements or specific partisan leaders in the last year to the rebellion or revolution. In the beginning of the book, he does really well to distinguish the different types of warfare that took place in South Carolina, because it wasn't just a conventional war between two regular armies. It was mostly a guerrilla war between partisan groups and British regulars. The Southern Theater, specifically South Carolina, can also be described as a civil war, a description that both Gordon and historians in the video use, and they argue that in 1780 and 1781, South Carolina looked a lot less like a revolution and a lot more like a civil war. But I mean, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. In the beginning of the war, things seemed to be going well for the American cause in South Carolina. By the end of 1775, they still held Charleston, and Cherokee attacks had basically ended because in the summer of 1776, there were so many retributions on both warriors and innocents that the Indians were forced to sue for peace. So for the next few years, the South saw very little action, military action, just because the conflict took place mainly in the North. Now, the British did try and fail to capture Sullivan's Island in 1776, but this failed thanks to the palmetto logs, strangely enough, of Fort Moultrie that the cannonballs just bounced off of or sunk into the spongy surface. Gordon also argues that the British attack at this time failed because they were too focused on capturing Sullivan's Island and not on Charleston itself. So different goals, different strategies. But they did learn from their mistakes of that frontal assault a few years later, when Clinton decided to take this significant port city, both for reasons of supply and because several key revolutionary leaders resided in the city. And as one of the military historians in the video pointed out, the British plan was to isolate the rebellion to keep it from spreading elsewhere. So anyway, instead of attacking the city head-on, Clinton first took Savannah, Georgia, before moving up the coast. And he hit several other South Carolina cities as he went. As a side note, Gordon's use of maps throughout the book was really helpful. It was really helpful for someone like me who needs that visual aid to just see the progression of either battles or military movements. So getting back, Clinton eventually reached Charleston, but because of strong fortifications on its harbor side, he decided to attack from land. And so he came at the city and outflanked it from the peninsula. Now the American Continental Army was in the city at the time under General Lincoln, and he managed to withstand the siege for about a month, but he eventually had to surrender Charleston in 1780. And the loss of Charleston was a blow to the American cause because it eliminated what little regular army they had in the South. So with Charleston now in British possession, they began to move into the backcountry of South Carolina to establish a line of forts as like a defensive stronghold. And, they believed that a large number of loyalists in this colony would prevent any significant resistance to their control. And as Gordon and the video points out, they would have been successful with this. They would have been right, but they made a few major blunders, very soon after taking Charleston. First of all, after paroling the men who had surrendered to his forces at Charleston, Clinton issued an ultimatum that said the colonists had to take an oath of allegiance to the crown, and if they didn't, for whatever reason, they'd be considered enemies to the crown, and they were treated as such. He had hoped this would intimidate the colonists in South Carolina, but it had the opposite effect. It actually angered them a lot more that he would demand this of them. Another mistake, this one made by Clinton's subordinate Tarleton, occurred soon after the siege had ended. Tarleton was supposed to chase down the fleeing remains of the Continental Army under the command of Colonel Buford. In a defeat that's come to be known as the Waxhaws Massacre, Tarleton's quarter further inflamed anti-British sentiment in the colony just because of the brutal nature of Tarleton's actions against the troops who were trying to surrender to him. And for this action, he only received a verbal reprimand, and so such atrocities continued under both Clinton and Cornwallis throughout the rest of the war. This is what really stirred the hornet's nest even more, Patriots used the incident as propaganda against the British. Now, we can't really say what would have happened if Tarleton would have simply captured the surrendering troops instead of massacring them. Maybe Clinton and Cornwallis wouldn't have had to face as many uprisings, and they might have even gained a lot more loyalist support, even with the ultimatum that Clinton had given. I mean, who knows? But what we do know is that the Waxhaws Massacre helped to fill the ranks of the partisan groups operating throughout South Carolina. Even after the defeats at Camden and Fishing Creek for Gates and Sumter respectively, partisan numbers continue to grow, and they continue to wage guerrilla warfare, largely because of the policies that Clinton had enacted and Cornwallis's lack of restraint on his troops' behavior towards the colonists, which enraged the South Carolinians throughout the war. And from past experience, they were used to solving their own problems, such as the Indians or the regulators prior to war. They were used to solving these problems through violence. Now, although the video ends at Cowpens, Gordon continues to move chronologically through the war, enumerating the different victories and defeats of both partisans and Green's regulars. He doesn't end with the surrender at Yorktown, but with the evacuation of Charleston in 1782, which finally returned the South Carolina city to American hands after the combination of both guerrilla and conventional warfare, which were brought on by poor policies and atrocities towards the colonists, had finally defeated the British in the South.